My name is Rachel Martinez, and I'm 34 years old. 3 weeks ago, I was folding laundry in our bedroom in suburban Denver, performing the same domestic routine I'd maintained for 8 years of marriage to my husband David. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sorting through David's work shirts when his laptop, which he'd left open on the dresser, chimed with an incoming email notification. The sound itself wasn't unusual. David received work emails constantly as a project manager for a construction company, but something about the timing made me glance at the screen. What I saw there would destroy my faith in my marriage and set in motion a series of events that would prove David had seriously underestimated the woman he'd chosen to betray. The email preview was from someone named Jennifer Walsh, with the subject line, "Divorce Filing Timeline and Custody Arrangements." My stomach dropped as I read the first few lines that were visible. David, as we discussed, I'll file the papers next Friday. Make sure you've secured the joint account funds before. The preview cut off there, but I'd seen enough to understand that my husband was planning to divorce me and had been coordinating with someone named Jennifer about financial and legal strategies that I knew nothing about. I stood frozen in our bedroom, holding one of David's perfectly pressed work shirts, as the implications of what I'd discovered crashed over me like a wave. David wasn't just planning to leave me, he was planning to leave me strategically, with legal and financial preparation that suggested this wasn't a sudden decision, but a calculated exit strategy. My hands were shaking as I set down the shirt and moved closer to the laptop. The email was still open in the preview pane, and I could see additional messages in the thread that dated back several months. I knew I should close the laptop and wait for David to come home so we could discuss whatever was happening between us. That would have been the mature, trusting response of a wife who believed in communication and marriage counseling. Instead, I opened the email thread and began reading the most devastating correspondence of my adult life. "Jennifer, I think we should move forward with the divorce filing," David had written 6 weeks earlier. "Rachel has been completely oblivious to my dissatisfaction, and I don't see any point in trying to work things out. I just want to make sure we handle the finances correctly so I don't get screwed in the settlement." Jennifer's response had been professionally detailed. "David, Colorado is an equitable distribution state, so Rachel will be entitled to a fair share of marital assets. However, if you can document that certain assets were acquired through your separate efforts or moved before filing, we might be able to protect more of your financial position." The thread continued for dozens of messages, revealing a months-long collaboration between David and Jennifer Walsh, who I now realized was a divorce attorney, to plan his exit from our marriage while maximizing his financial advantage and minimizing mine. "I've been setting aside cash from my paychecks and bonuses," David had written in one message. "Rachel handles most of the household finances, so she hasn't noticed the redirected funds. I should have about $15,000 in my separate account by the time we file." "That's good planning," Jennifer had replied. "What about the joint savings account? How much is currently in there?" "About $47,000. Rachel has been contributing her teacher's salary to that account for years, while I've been putting most of my income toward investments and retirement. She thinks we're building wealth together, but technically those investment accounts are in my name only." Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach. For 8 years, I'd been diligently contributing my modest teacher's salary to our joint savings account, believing that we were building financial security together for our future family. Meanwhile, David had been funneling his substantially higher income into accounts that excluded me while planning to claim the joint savings as part of his divorce strategy. The email thread revealed additional devastating details about David's planned betrayal. He'd been documenting what he characterized as my excessive spending on household expenses, apparently building a case that I was financially irresponsible and shouldn't receive substantial assets in a divorce settlement. "Rachel spends way too much money on groceries and household items," David had complained to Jennifer. "I have receipts showing she regularly spends $200 per week on food and supplies for just the two of us." I almost laughed at the absurdity of that complaint. I'd been carefully budgeting and meal planning to keep our household expenses reasonable while maintaining the comfortable lifestyle that David expected. The fact that he was characterizing my careful management of our household as excessive spending revealed how completely he'd reframed our entire marriage to justify his planned betrayal. But the most painful revelation came in an email from 3 weeks earlier, where David had discussed the emotional aspects of his exit strategy. "Jennifer, I need to be clear about something," David had written. "I don't hate Rachel, and I don't think she's a bad person. I just don't want to be married to her anymore. We've grown apart, and I want to start over with someone who shares my ambitions and lifestyle goals." "Have you considered marriage counseling?" Jennifer had asked. "There's no point," David had replied. "Rachel is satisfied with our life the way it is. She likes teaching, she wants kids, and she's content with our current income level. I want more than that. I want to build real wealth, travel, and live more adventurously. We're just incompatible at a fundamental level. The casual dismissal of our 8-year marriage as simple incompatibility was devastating, but what hurt even more was his assumption that I would be satisfied with whatever decisions he made about our future without consulting me. David had never expressed dissatisfaction with our marriage or suggested that we had different goals. He'd never mentioned wanting to travel more or feeling constrained by our lifestyle. Instead, he'd apparently spent months planning his exit while maintaining the pretense of a committed marriage. As I continued reading through the emails, I discovered that David's exit strategy included more than just financial planning. He'd been preparing to move in with a coworker named Amanda Peterson immediately after filing for divorce. Amanda has agreed to let me stay at her place while the divorce is pending, David had written. That should save money and provide some emotional support during what I assume will be a difficult process. The revelation that David had been planning his post-marriage living arrangements with another woman added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. He hadn't just decided to leave me. He'd decided to leave me for someone else while systematically planning to minimize my financial security in the process. By the time I finished reading the email thread, I understood that David's divorce filing was imminent and that he'd been calculating every aspect of our separation to his advantage while keeping me completely uninformed about his intentions. But David had made one crucial miscalculation in his careful planning. He'd assumed that I would remain oblivious to his strategy until it was too late for me to protect myself. That assumption was about to prove very costly. I closed the laptop and walked downstairs to our home office, where I kept our financial records and account information. For the next 2 hours, I methodically reviewed our bank statements, investment accounts, and credit card records, documenting David's pattern of financial maneuvering and my own contributions to our marital assets. What I discovered was even worse than the emails had suggested. David had been systematically reducing his contributions to our joint account while redirecting funds to individual accounts that I hadn't known existed. Meanwhile, my teacher's salary had been covering an increasing share of our household expenses, effectively subsidizing David's secret wealth accumulation. But I also discovered something that David apparently hadn't considered in his exit planning. As a joint account holder, I had full legal access to the $47,000 in savings that he was planning to claim in the divorce settlement. That evening, as I prepared dinner and waited for David to come home from work, I made a decision that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in our marriage dissolution. I was going to protect myself financially before David had the opportunity to implement his carefully planned strategy. By the time David discovered my defensive moves, his oblivious wife would have proven that she was much more strategic than he'd ever imagined. The next morning, after David left for work with his usual kiss goodbye and casual have a good day that now felt like an elaborate performance, I called in sick to my job at Jefferson Elementary School and began implementing a financial protection strategy that would ensure I wasn't blindsided by his planned divorce filing. My first call was to Patricia Williams, a family law attorney whose name I'd found through the Colorado Bar Association's website. I'd never imagined I would need a divorce lawyer, but David's emails had made it clear that I needed professional guidance to protect myself from his calculated approach to ending our marriage. Ms. Martinez, Patricia said during our phone consultation, if your husband is planning to file for divorce without your knowledge while attempting to hide assets, you need to act quickly to preserve your financial position. I explained what I'd discovered in David's email correspondence, including his strategy to claim the joint savings account and his months of redirecting income to individual accounts. The fact that he's been systematically moving money while planning a divorce could constitute financial misconduct, Patricia explained. Colorado courts don't look favorably on spouses who attempt to hide assets or manipulate finances before filing. What can I do to protect myself? First, document everything. Print those emails, gather financial records, and create a comprehensive picture of your marital assets and his financial maneuvering. Second, consider protecting the joint account funds before he has the opportunity to claim them. Patricia's advice confirmed what I'd been thinking since discovering David's emails. As a joint account holder, I had every legal right to access our savings, and waiting for David to implement his strategy would leave me financially vulnerable. After hanging up with Patricia, I drove to our bank and made what would turn out to be the most satisfying transaction of my adult life. I'd like to make a withdrawal from our joint savings account, I told the teller, presenting my identification and account information. How much would you like to withdraw, Mrs. Martinez? The entire balance, I replied. $47,238. The teller looked surprised, but processed the transaction without question. 20 minutes later, I walked out of the bank with a cashier's check for the full amount of our joint savings, money that David had been planning to claim in his divorce strategy. But I wasn't finished with my financial protection plan. My second stop was a different bank across town, where I opened a new individual account and deposited the cashier's check. The account was in my name only, ensuring that David would have no access to the funds he'd been counting on for his post-divorce financial security. Mrs. Martinez, this is a substantial deposit, the bank manager noted. Are you planning any major purchases or investments? I'm planning for my financial independence, I replied, which was absolutely true, even if she didn't understand the full context. Over the next 3 days, while David continued his normal routine of work, evening television, and weekend golf, I systematically documented every aspect of our financial situation and his apparent deception. I printed the entire email thread between David and Jennifer Walsh, creating a comprehensive record of his planned betrayal and financial manipulation. I photographed our financial records, including bank statements that showed his pattern of reducing contributions to our joint account, while my teacher's salary covered increasing household expenses. Most importantly, I contacted an appraiser to assess the value of our house and other significant assets, ensuring that I had professional documentation of our marital property's worth. The appraiser's report was enlightening. Our house, which we'd purchased 5 years earlier for $320,000, was now worth $425,000. David's individual investment accounts, which I'd discovered through careful review of our tax returns, contained approximately $85,000 that had been accumulated during our marriage, using income he'd claimed was going toward our joint financial goals. Mrs. Martinez, said the appraiser, you've built substantial equity in this property. The improvements and maintenance over the past 5 years have significantly increased its value. The irony was bitter. My careful attention to our home's upkeep and improvements had increased our largest marital asset by over $100,000, while David had been secretly accumulating individual wealth and planning to minimize my share of our joint property. But the most revealing discovery came when I reviewed our credit card statements for the past 6 months. David had been making charges that I'd assumed were work-related expenses, but which now appeared to be personal purchases for his planned new life with Amanda Peterson, restaurant charges at places we'd never been together, hotel expenses during supposed business trips that lined up with Amanda's social media posts about weekend getaways, even purchases at jewelry stores that had never resulted in gifts for me. David has been using our joint credit to finance his affair and his exit strategy, I explained to Patricia during our second consultation. He's been charging personal expenses for his relationship with Amanda, while I've been paying off the credit card balances with my salary. Patricia reviewed the evidence I'd compiled with growing enthusiasm. Rachel, you've documented a clear pattern of financial misconduct and marital asset dissipation. This gives us significant leverage in divorce proceedings. What happens next? We file first, Patricia said with satisfaction. We beat David to the courthouse and establish you as the petitioner rather than the respondent. That puts you in control of the narrative and timing. The strategic advantage of filing first hadn't occurred to me, but Patricia's explanation made perfect sense. Instead of being the surprised wife responding to David's calculated divorce petition, I would be the prepared petitioner presenting evidence of his deception and financial misconduct. Patricia, there's something else I need to tell you, I said. I've already moved the joint savings account funds to protect them from David's planned appropriation. Patricia smiled broadly. That was excellent thinking. You've preserved marital assets that your husband was attempting to claim improperly. Over the next week, Patricia and I prepared a comprehensive divorce petition that included claims for financial misconduct, asset dissipation, and spousal support based on David's substantially higher income and his systematic financial deception. The petition also included a request for temporary orders that would prevent David from accessing or disposing of any marital assets while the divorce was pending. Rachel, your husband has been planning this divorce for months, but he's made one crucial mistake, Patricia explained as we finalized our filing strategy. What mistake? He assumed you would remain passive and uninformed until it was too late for you to protect yourself. Instead, you've documented his misconduct and secured your financial position before he even knows you're aware of his plans. The divorce papers were filed on Thursday morning, exactly 1 day before David's planned filing, according to his email correspondence with Jennifer Walsh. But I wasn't ready to serve David with the papers yet. I wanted him to discover my strategic moves in the most dramatic way possible, by trying to implement his own plan and discovering that I'd already anticipated and countered every aspect of his strategy. That Friday afternoon, I sat in our living room reading a book and waiting for David to come home from work. According to his emails, he was supposed to meet with Jennifer Walsh that evening to finalize his divorce filing and discuss transferring the joint account funds. I was looking forward to watching him discover that his oblivious wife had been several steps ahead of him throughout his entire deception. When David walked through the front door at 6:15 p.m., he looked more nervous than I'd seen him in years. "Hi, honey," he said, his voice carrying a tension that suggested he was preparing for a difficult conversation. How was your day? Very productive, I replied honestly. I accomplished several important financial tasks. David looked confused by my response, but he couldn't have imagined what those financial tasks had actually involved. Rachel, I need to talk to you about something important, David began, apparently ready to implement his planned revelation. I'm sure you do, I said with a smile that probably confused him even more. What David didn't know was that he was about to discover that I'd already found his emails, emptied our joint account, filed for divorce, and documented evidence of his financial misconduct and affair. His carefully planned surprise was about to become my strategic victory. David stood in our living room, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly rehearsing the speech he'd planned to deliver about wanting a divorce. I could see him working up the courage to begin what he'd assumed would be a devastating surprise that would leave me emotionally and financially unprepared. Rachel, he said finally, I think we need to have a serious conversation about our marriage. I agree completely, I replied, setting down my book and giving him my full attention. I think there are several things we need to discuss. David looked slightly encouraged by what he interpreted as my receptiveness to his planned revelation. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about our relationship and our future together. That's interesting, I said. I've been doing some thinking about our future too, and our finances. Something in my tone made David pause. He'd been expecting emotional vulnerability or confused questions about what he meant. Instead, I was responding with calm confidence that suggested I knew more than he'd expected. What kind of thinking about our finances? David asked cautiously. Well, I've been reviewing our bank accounts, investment records, and spending patterns over the past few years, I said, watching his face carefully. I've discovered some interesting discrepancies that I think we should address. David's complexion went pale. What kind of discrepancies? For example, I noticed that your contributions to our joint savings account have decreased significantly over the past year, while my salary has been covering an increasing share of our household expenses. Rachel, I don't think this is the right time to discuss financial details. Actually, David, I think this is exactly the right time, I replied, standing up and walking to our home office. Let me show you what I've discovered. I returned with a folder containing printouts of our financial records, including the bank statements that showed David's pattern of financial maneuvering. These records show that you've been systematically reducing your contributions to our joint account while redirecting funds to individual accounts that I wasn't aware existed. David stared at the documents with growing panic. Rachel, how did you get access to my individual account information? Tax returns, I replied simply. Amazing what you can learn when you actually review the documents you've been signing for years. David sat down heavily on our couch, apparently realizing that his planned conversation wasn't going according to script. David, I also found some interesting emails on your laptop, I continued, deciding it was time to reveal the full extent of my knowledge. The blood drained from David's face completely. You went through my emails? Your laptop was open, and I saw an email from Jennifer Walsh about divorce filing timelines. Naturally, I was curious about why my husband was corresponding with a divorce attorney without my knowledge. David's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. He'd been preparing to surprise me with news of his planned divorce, but now he was discovering that I'd already uncovered his entire strategy. Rachel, I can explain. You can explain how you've been planning to divorce me for months while encouraging me to continue contributing my salary to accounts you were planning to claim in the settlement? I interrupted. Or you can explain how you've been using our joint credit cards to finance your relationship with Amanda Peterson? The mention of Amanda's name was the final blow. David slumped forward with his head in his hands, apparently realizing that his months of careful planning had been completely exposed. How long have you known? He asked quietly. I found your emails 4 days ago, I replied. Since then, I've been quite busy protecting myself from your planned financial manipulation. What do you mean, protecting yourself? I smiled at David's question, savoring the moment when I would reveal that his strategic planning had been completely outmaneuvered. Well, for starters, I've moved the joint savings account funds to prevent you from claiming them inappropriately. David's head snapped up. You did what? I withdrew the entire balance, $47,238, and deposited it in an individual account where you can't access it. Rachel, you can't do that. That money belongs to both of us. Exactly, I agreed. It belongs to both of us, which is why I moved it to prevent you from claiming it unilaterally in your planned divorce filing. David stared at me with an expression of shock and growing anger. You had no right to empty our savings account. I had every right as a joint account holder, I corrected, just as you had every right to redirect your income to individual accounts while planning to divorce me. The difference is that my actions were protective, while yours were deceptive. David stood up and began pacing around the living room. Rachel, this is insane. We need to discuss this rationally. I agree completely, I said. Which is why I've hired an attorney and filed for divorce this morning. The words hit David like a physical blow. He stopped pacing and stared at me with complete incredulity. You filed for divorce? But I was going to… You were going to file next Friday, I finished. According to your email correspondence with Jennifer Walsh. Unfortunately for your timeline, I filed first. David's carefully planned strategy was crumbling before his eyes, and I could see him struggling to understand how his oblivious wife had managed to anticipate and counter every aspect of his approach. David, did you really think I was so naive that I wouldn't eventually discover your affair with Amanda Peterson and your financial manipulation? It's not an affair, David protested weakly. Amanda and I haven't… We're just friends who have feelings for each other. David, you've been using our joint credit cards to pay for hotel rooms and restaurant dinners with Amanda while telling me you were traveling for work. I showed him credit card statements with charges that corresponded to Amanda's social media posts about romantic weekend getaways. You've been financing your emotional affair with my money while planning to divorce me and claim our joint assets. David examined the credit card evidence with growing desperation. Rachel, you're taking all of this out of context. Yes, I've been unhappy in our marriage, and yes, I've developed feelings for someone else, but I was planning to handle the divorce fairly. Fairly? I laughed. David, your emails with Jennifer Walsh specifically discuss strategies to minimize my share of marital assets and claim our joint savings account. How is that fair? I earned most of that money through my job, and I contributed my entire salary to our joint expenses while you were secretly accumulating individual wealth, I replied. For 8 years, I've been subsidizing your lifestyle and building our shared assets while you plan to exclude me from the benefits of that collaboration. David slumped back onto the couch, apparently overwhelmed by how completely his planned divorce had been preempted by my defensive actions. What happens now? He asked. Now we proceed with the divorce that you've wanted for months, I said. Except instead of being the surprised victim of your calculated betrayal, I'm the prepared petitioner who's documented your financial misconduct and asset dissipation. Rachel, we don't have to make this adversarial. We can work out a fair settlement. David, you made this adversarial when you spent months planning to manipulate our divorce to your financial advantage while keeping me completely uninformed. I showed him the divorce petition that Patricia had filed that morning, including the claims for financial misconduct and the temporary orders preventing him from disposing of marital assets. Your affair with Amanda, your financial deception, and your systematic planning to disadvantage me in the divorce settlement are all documented in legal filings that will become part of the public record. David read through the petition with increasing horror, apparently realizing that his months of careful planning had resulted in a legal position that was far worse than anything he'd anticipated. Rachel, this petition makes me look like a criminal. You committed financial misconduct and asset dissipation while planning to defraud me in divorce proceedings, I replied. The petition accurately describes your behavior. What do you want from me? I looked at David, the man I'd loved and trusted for 8 years, who had repaid that love and trust with systematic deception and planned betrayal, and realized that I wanted something he could never give me, the restoration of the honest marriage I'd thought we had. I want a fair division of our actual marital assets, including the individual accounts you've been hiding, I said. I want appropriate spousal support based on the income disparity you've created through your financial manipulation. And I want you to understand that your assumption about my passivity and naivety was completely wrong. David had planned to surprise me with a divorce that would leave me emotionally devastated and financially disadvantaged. Instead, he was discovering that his strategic planning had been anticipated and countered by the wife he'd assumed was too trusting to protect herself. Sometimes the best defense against betrayal is to be more strategic than the person trying to betray you. The 6 months following my confrontation with David played out exactly as Patricia Williams had predicted. His months of calculated planning to manipulate our divorce had created a legal position that was far worse for him than if he'd simply been honest about wanting to end our marriage. The temporary orders that Patricia had secured prevented David from accessing any marital assets or making major financial decisions while the divorce was pending. This meant that the $47,000 I'd moved from our joint account remained secure, while David's planned strategy to claim those funds immediately was completely blocked. Rachel, your husband's attorney is requesting a settlement conference, Patricia informed me during one of our regular strategy meetings. I think they're beginning to understand how badly his deceptive approach has damaged his legal position. Jennifer Walsh, who was now representing David in the divorce she'd helped him plan, had been forced to defend his financial misconduct and asset dissipation rather than executing the aggressive strategy they'd originally discussed. What kind of settlement are they proposing? I asked. Patricia smiled with satisfaction. They're offering to split all marital assets 50-50, including the individual investment accounts that David had been planning to claim as separate property. The offer represented a complete reversal from David's original strategy to minimize my share of our assets. His attempts to hide individual accounts and claim our joint savings had backfired so dramatically that he was now offering me more than I would have received under standard Colorado divorce law. What about spousal support? They're offering temporary spousal support of $2,000 per month for 3 years, plus they'll cover your attorney's fees. The spousal support offer was particularly satisfying because David's own emails had documented the income disparity he'd created through his financial manipulation. His correspondence with Jennifer Walsh had specifically discussed how my teacher's salary was substantially lower than his construction management income, language that now supported my claim for ongoing financial support. Patricia, this settlement offer is much better than what David was planning to give me in his original strategy. That's exactly right, Patricia agreed. His deceptive approach has resulted in a much worse outcome for him than honest divorce proceedings would have produced. But the settlement negotiations revealed additional misconduct that we hadn't discovered during our initial investigation. David's financial records, which we'd subpoenaed during discovery, showed that he'd been systematically underreporting his income to reduce his child support obligations in the divorce he'd been planning. Rachel, your husband has been receiving substantial performance bonuses and overtime payments that he never deposited into your joint account, Patricia explained as we reviewed his employment records. His actual income is about 30% higher than what he'd been claiming. The income underreporting meant that David owed additional spousal support retroactively, and it provided evidence of ongoing financial deception that strengthened our position in negotiations. How much additional income are we talking about? Approximately $85,000 over the past 3 years, Patricia replied. Money that should have been contributing to your joint financial goals but was instead directed to his individual accounts. The discovery of hidden income triggered additional legal consequences for David. Under Colorado law, systematic concealment of marital income could result in sanctions and enhanced asset division awards. David's attorney is now requesting an expedited settlement conference, Patricia told me after the income discovery was revealed. I think they want to resolve this before additional misconduct comes to light. The settlement conference was held in a neutral conference room downtown, with both attorneys present to facilitate negotiations. David looked haggard and defeated, apparently exhausted by months of legal proceedings that had exposed every aspect of his planned betrayal. Ms. Martinez, said Jennifer Walsh, my client is prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement that addresses all outstanding issues. The revised offer was even more favorable than their previous proposal. 60% of all marital assets, including David's individual investment accounts, spousal support of $2,500 per month for 4 years, and David's assumption of responsibility for all marital debts, including the credit card balances he'd accumulated financing his relationship with Amanda. This settlement recognizes that Mr. Martinez engaged in financial misconduct that disadvantaged his wife during their marriage, Jennifer admitted reluctantly. We believe this offer fairly compensates Ms. Martinez for those actions. Patricia reviewed the offer carefully before responding. This settlement is acceptable, but we want one additional provision. What provision? Jennifer asked. We want a clause stating that if Mr. Martinez remarries Amanda Peterson within 2 years of the divorce finalization, he'll pay an additional $25,000 to Ms. Martinez as compensation for the marital assets he dissipated financing their relationship. The provision was particularly satisfying because David's emails had specifically discussed his plans to start fresh with Amanda, using the financial advantages he'd expected to gain from manipulating our divorce. David's face flushed red as he realized that his planned new life with Amanda would now cost him substantial additional money if they formalized their relationship too quickly. That's punitive, David protested. That's consequences, I replied. You used our marital assets to finance your relationship with Amanda while planning to divorce me. If you want to continue that relationship, you should pay for the privilege. After 2 hours of negotiation, David agreed to all terms, including the remarriage penalty clause. The final settlement gave me significantly more than I would have received under standard asset division rules, while holding David financially accountable for his deceptive behavior. Rachel, this settlement represents one of the most favorable outcomes I've achieved for a client, Patricia told me as we finalized the paperwork. Your decision to document David's misconduct and protect yourself financially transformed what could have been a devastating betrayal into a strategic victory. The divorce was finalized 3 months later in a brief court hearing where Judge Patricia Martinez reviewed our settlement agreement and confirmed its terms. This case illustrates the importance of financial transparency in marriage, Judge Martinez commented during the hearing. Mr. Martinez's attempts to manipulate the divorce process through deception and asset concealment resulted in legal consequences that far exceeded what honest proceedings would have produced. As David and I left the courthouse as officially divorced individuals, I reflected on how completely the power dynamic of our separation had been reversed through strategic preparation and legal accountability. "Rachel," David said as we reached the parking garage, "I want you to know that I never intended for things to get this complicated. David, you intended to manipulate our divorce to your financial advantage while keeping me uninformed about your plans," I replied. "The complications arose when I discovered your strategy and protected myself accordingly. I hope you'll be happy with your settlement." "I'm happy with the justice," I corrected. "The settlement simply reflects the legal consequences of your choices." 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a wedding invitation that provided the final validation of my strategic approach to our marriage dissolution. David Martinez and Amanda Peterson were announcing their engagement, with a wedding planned for 8 months later, exactly 2 weeks after the 2-year remarriage penalty period expired. The timing confirmed that David had taken the financial consequences of his deception seriously enough to delay his planned new marriage until it wouldn't cost him an additional $25,000. But by that time, I'd used my divorce settlement to purchase a beautiful townhouse in downtown Denver, establish a substantial emergency fund, and begin pursuing a master's degree in education administration that would advance my teaching career. The woman David had assumed would be devastated by his calculated betrayal had instead used his own deceptive strategy to secure financial independence and professional advancement that exceeded anything I could have achieved while married to someone who viewed our partnership as a zero-sum competition. Sometimes the best response to betrayal is to be more strategic than the person trying to betray you. And sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people experience the full consequences of their own actions. 2 years after folding David's shirts and discovering the emails that would change my life forever, I was standing in the kitchen of my downtown Denver townhouse, preparing dinner for myself and my new boyfriend, Marcus Chen, a fellow teacher who understood that partnership meant mutual support rather than strategic competition. The contrast between my current life and my marriage to David was striking in ways that went far beyond just the difference between honesty and deception. With Marcus, I'd discovered what it felt like to be in a relationship where financial decisions were discussed openly, where career goals were supported mutually, and where neither partner viewed the other's success as a threat to their own advancement. "Rachel, I still can't believe what David put you through," Marcus said as he helped me set the table with dishes I'd purchased using the divorce settlement funds. "Planning to divorce you while encouraging you to keep contributing your salary to joint accounts? That's not just deceptive, it's cruel." "The cruelty was the worst part," I agreed, reflecting on how David's betrayal had affected not just my finances, but my ability to trust my own judgment about people and relationships. It wasn't just that he wanted a divorce. It was that he planned to devastate me financially while pretending to be a loving husband. The emotional recovery from David's systematic deception had taken longer than the legal resolution of our divorce. Even with a favorable financial settlement, I'd struggled with self-doubt about my ability to recognize dishonesty and manipulation in future relationships. "But Marcus, what I learned from that experience is that I'm much stronger and more strategic than I'd ever realized," I continued. "David assumed I was passive and naive, and that assumption cost him everything. The divorce settlement had indeed transformed my financial situation in ways that exceeded my most optimistic expectations during my marriage. The $180,000 I'd received from asset division, combined with the spousal support payments, had allowed me to purchase my townhouse outright and establish an investment portfolio that was growing steadily. More importantly, the settlement had provided the financial security I needed to pursue career advancement without worrying about immediate income requirements. I'd completed my master's degree in education administration and had been promoted to assistant principal at Jefferson Elementary School, with a salary increase that reflected both my advanced education and my leadership capabilities. The irony is that David's attempt to manipulate our divorce actually accelerated my financial independence, I told Marcus as we sat down to dinner. If he'd been honest about wanting a divorce, I would have received much less in the settlement. "His greed and deception backfired completely," Marcus observed. "By trying to take advantage of you, he created legal consequences that cost him far more than honest proceedings would have." The legal precedent established by my case had broader implications beyond just my personal situation. Patricia Williams had written about Morrison versus Martinez in legal journals as an example of how financial misconduct during marriage dissolution could result in enhanced damages and asset forfeiture. Rachel's case demonstrates that courts will impose serious consequences on spouses who attempt to manipulate divorce proceedings through deception and asset concealment, Patricia had written in the Colorado Bar Journal. Her strategic response to her husband's planned betrayal has become a model for protecting vulnerable spouses from financial exploitation. Law schools throughout Colorado were teaching my case as an example of effective divorce strategy and financial self-protection. I'd been invited to speak at continuing education seminars for family law attorneys about recognizing and countering spousal financial misconduct. The most important lesson from my experience, I'd told one audience of attorneys, is that documentation and strategic thinking can transform a devastating betrayal into a legal victory. Don't assume that emotional trauma prevents rational decision-making. But the most satisfying validation of my approach had come from other women who had faced similar betrayals and had used my case as a template for protecting themselves. Ms. Martinez, your case gave me the courage and strategy to investigate my husband's suspicious financial behavior, one woman had written to me through Patricia's office. I discovered that he'd been hiding assets and planning to divorce me while claiming poverty. Using your approach, I documented everything and filed first. The settlement I received will allow me to rebuild my life with dignity. Similar letters had arrived regularly over the past 2 years from women whose husbands had underestimated their intelligence and determination, only to discover that strategic thinking could overcome even carefully planned betrayals. The broader impact extended beyond just individual divorce cases. Financial institutions in Colorado had begun implementing new policies requiring both spouses to acknowledge major account changes, partly in response to cases like mine where one spouse had manipulated joint accounts without the other's knowledge. David's attempt to empty our joint savings account before filing for divorce highlighted a gap in banking protections, Patricia had explained during a recent legal conference. Financial institutions now have better safeguards to prevent one spouse from unilaterally claiming joint assets during marriage dissolution. 3 months after my divorce was finalized, I'd received a call from David that provided insight into how completely his planned strategy had backfired. "Rachel, I need to ask you something," David had said, his voice carrying none of the confidence he'd displayed during our marriage. "Would you consider modifying the spousal support arrangement? Amanda and I are planning to buy a house, and the monthly payments are making it difficult to qualify for a mortgage." The request had been both ironic and satisfying. David was struggling financially because the divorce settlement he'd tried to manipulate had resulted in ongoing obligations that constrained his ability to build wealth with his new partner. "David, the spousal support amount was determined based on the income disparity you created through your financial manipulation," I'd replied. "If you're having trouble meeting your legal obligations, you should discuss payment modification with your attorney. Rachel, please. I know I made mistakes, but can't we work something out that helps both of us? The settlement we reached helps me by providing the financial security you tried to deny me through deception," I'd said. "I'm not interested in reducing my court-ordered support to help you finance a new life with the woman you cheated with." David had hung up without further discussion, apparently realizing that his former wife was no longer the accommodating partner who had prioritized his comfort over her own interests. 6 months later, I'd learned through mutual acquaintances that David and Amanda had been forced to delay their house purchase because his spousal support obligations affected his debt-to-income ratio for mortgage qualification. "It's poetic justice," Marcus had observed when I'd shared that information. David's attempt to secure financial advantages through divorce manipulation has resulted in ongoing financial constraints that affect his new relationship. The remarriage penalty clause that Patricia had negotiated had proven equally effective. David and Amanda had postponed their wedding until after the 2-year restriction period expired, apparently unwilling to pay the $25,000 penalty for formalizing their relationship too quickly. They waited exactly 2 years and 2 weeks to get married, I'd told Marcus after receiving their wedding announcement. David took the financial consequences seriously enough to delay his new marriage until it wouldn't cost him additional money. But by that time, my own life had moved far beyond the drama of David's choices and consequences. The master's degree I'd completed using divorce settlement funds had led to my promotion to assistant principal, with a salary that exceeded what I'd been earning as a classroom teacher. More importantly, my relationship with Marcus had demonstrated what healthy partnership actually looked like. We maintained separate financial accounts while contributing equally to shared expenses. We discussed major decisions openly and supported each other's career advancement. Neither of us viewed the other's success as a threat to our own security. "Marcus, the contrast between my marriage to David and our relationship is like comparing manipulation to genuine partnership," I told him recently. "With David, I was always trying to figure out what he really wanted or what he was hiding. With you, I never have to question your honesty or your commitment. That's what partnership should be," Marcus had replied. "Mutual support and shared goals, not strategic competition." The townhouse I'd purchased with my divorce settlement had become a symbol of the independence and security I'd gained through strategic response to betrayal. The investment portfolio I'd established was growing steadily, providing financial foundation that I'd never achieved during my marriage. Most importantly, I'd discovered that I possessed capabilities for strategic thinking and self-protection that I'd never needed to develop during my marriage to David. His betrayal had forced me to become more resourceful, more decisive, and more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges life might present. Rachel, do you ever regret how things ended with David? Marcus asked as we finished dinner and began planning our weekend activities. I regret that I wasted 8 years with someone who viewed our marriage as a strategic opportunity rather than a genuine partnership, I replied. But I don't regret how I handled his betrayal. My response to his deception changed my life in ways that have been entirely positive. What's the most important thing you learned from that experience? I thought about Marcus's question as I looked around my beautiful townhouse, furnished with items I'd chosen according to my own preferences, rather than negotiating with someone whose tastes and priorities were fundamentally incompatible with mine. I learned that other people's assumptions about your capabilities often reveal more about their limitations than yours, I said. David assumed I was passive and naive because those assumptions justified his planned betrayal. His mistake was thinking that being kind and trusting meant being weak and stupid. And now? Now I know that I can be both kind and strategic, both trusting and protective, I replied. David's betrayal taught me that the best defense against manipulation is to be more strategic than the person trying to manipulate you. The lesson had applications beyond just marriage and divorce. In my role as assistant principal, I'd become known for my ability to handle difficult situations with parents, teachers, and administrators through careful preparation and strategic communication. Ms. Martinez has a talent for turning potentially adversarial situations into collaborative problem-solving, my principal had written in my most recent performance evaluation. Her approach to conflict resolution reflects both emotional intelligence and strategic thinking. As Marcus and I planned our evening, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by discovering David's emails while folding his shirts. That moment of devastating revelation had set in motion a series of strategic decisions that had led to financial independence, career advancement, and a healthy relationship with someone who valued partnership over manipulation. David had assumed that his careful planning would allow him to leave our marriage with maximum financial advantage and minimum consequences. Instead, his deceptive approach had resulted in legal and financial outcomes that were far worse than honest divorce proceedings would have produced. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being more strategic than the person trying to betray you. And sometimes the most satisfying victory is discovering that you're much stronger and more capable than anyone, including yourself, had ever imagined. The woman who had been folding shirts and discovering betrayal 2 years earlier had become someone who would never again underestimate her own ability to protect herself and build the life she deserved.